welcome back to our discussions on eschatology, apocalyptic literature, and just kind of talking about how this all fits into the times that we're in. I'm here again with Dr. David Nystrom from Western Seminary. Thank you again, David, for joining us.
My pleasure, Matt. My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been really awesome to get the chance to talk through just a little bit of what Scripture says, how it's kind of designed and put together, and the types of things that it reveals for us. And David, what are some good things as we get ready to talk through some of the texts that are good reminders for us to see overall as we go into this?
Yeah, I think so. Big picture, bird's eye view, eschatology, doctrine of the last things, apocalyptic from apocalypsis, the Greek word which means unveiling. And the question is, unveiling of what? And yes, it is about the last things. But it's also about maybe three ways of looking at the last things. And that's what sometimes makes apocalyptic literature confusing, because we don't know for sure, if we're not sure which one of those three reference subject matters are being referred to at any given time. So on the one hand, it's about individual eschatology. What happens to individuals when we die? So the four last things: heaven, hell, death, judgment. But there's also what's called national eschatology. And by national, it's not so much nations like countries, but people groups. So what's the fate of people groups? And you can remember that in Genesis at the Tower of Babel incident, that languages are confused and the people groups are dispersed. And yet very early on in Genesis 12:3b, the covenant with Abraham, there's this promise, this idea is out there that God reveals. He wants to bless not only Abram, but that through him all peoples of the earth will be blessed. Mm-hmm. So there's already very early in Genesis this idea that there's a big plan that God has, which is reconciliation.
Amen.
And that's another way really to think about eschatology. It's really about God's big plan, overarching narrative to bring reconciliation, all things to himself. And in the book of Revelation, those two, individual eschatology and national eschatology, those are in view at really the same time. And that's what leads to some of the confusion. But the third, which is sometimes called historical, or you might say cosmic, or the maturing purpose of God, is that even the forces, the angelic spiritual forces allied with Satan, the principalities and the powers, even those are going to be reconciled. And we see this very clearly in Ephesians 2 and 3, where God is, through the church, going to make known to the principalities and powers the secret plan of God. So three different reference: individual, national, people groups, as well as the cosmic forces. All of them are involved, and that adds to the complexity.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because what's good is now we're going to start walking into some of the texts, and we're going to get a chance to start really looking at what are some of these pieces that you're watching unfold. And like you were talking about, it starts in the very beginning, and it's tracking all the way through. And so as we've been talking about this apocalyptic literature, eschatological language, we end up entering this world, and especially in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, it becomes very unusual, becomes very disorienting.
That's right.
Yeah.
So Matt, I'm really hoping that you can, I'm trusting you because you know more about this than I do, about leading us through the Old Testament and showing some of the ways in which these ideas and this literature is laid before us.
Yeah, we're just going to kind of set a foundation, just really briefly, to talk through some of these pieces in the Old Testament to see how they interconnect and how they get built upon in the New Testament. Because anytime you're looking at all of this in the scriptures, you need to see how they're all interconnected, because they're all using shared imagery, shared terms, and they're working off of that because those are familiar, at least initially, to the original audiences. And then the more we're familiar with it, it becomes familiar in the connections. And so one of the things you'll see as you start getting into Old Testament texts is you'll start seeing key terms, key themes, language that comes out. So you'll see things in reference to time, and Testament will keep saying terms like in the latter years or in at the appointed times of which I have spoken. You'll see it talk about, as we get into Daniel, it'll talk about time, times, and half a
Yeah.
time. You'll see them talk about 7 years and 3 years and 70 years and weeks. But you also see some of these cosmic themes where you'll see things referencing the sun and the moon and the stars
Right.
and the earth and earthquakes happening. And so cosmic has to do with elements of nature that either become hypernatural in their activity, that they're getting attention of the people that are living on earth and seeing all these things happen. But then it's also full of all these different symbolic themes. So you'll have terms like the sea brewing and stuff coming out of the sea. You'll see beasts referenced multiple times within all these prophecies in this language. Horns is a very common term that gets used, representing often strengths and more specifically kings
Right.
who are strong. And then you'll see it talk about humanity and mankind. You'll see it talk about animals to be symbolic imagery. Lots of feasts, and there'll be feasts that are good, that are coming together at the feast of the Lord. But then you also see terminology of bad feasts that are going to be birds of prey and carrion coming and feasting on dead bodies. And then you'll also get terms like numbers of perfection, 7 being used, and we mentioned that a little bit already. And so another good thing to realize is that almost all of the key texts in the Old Testament are always coming from people that are in exile or coming out of exile or
Oh.
going into exile. And some people have even noted that that's something that you see even when John is writing on Patmos,
Oh,
he is in exile. And so if John's in exile and he's also drawing upon the language of these prophets in the Old Testament that are speaking from contexts of exile, that affects how they're understanding their lives, persecution, and all those things. So we're just going to go through a few texts really quick. One within the Old Testament that some people call the little apocalypse is Isaiah chapter 24 to 27. They also will make references to the book of Joel, but we're just going to kind of focus on this one here. And the thing about Isaiah 24 to 27 is it gives kind of a little bit of a mini picture of kind of the end with this apocalyptic language. And so you'll see it start by talking about the Lord will empty the earth and he'll make it desolate and he'll twist its surface and he'll scatter its inhabitants. But then as it moves along, it's going to start talking about judgment, and it will talk about God punishing the host of heaven in heaven and the kings of the earth on earth. And so you see God dealing on both realms with this judgment that's coming. But then it will move into some of that imagery of feasts. And as in Isaiah 25, you'll see a feast of rich food for all peoples, that they can come and enjoy this almost connection with the Lord. And that's where in verses 7 and 8, it will also talk about how he's going to swallow up death. And he's going to start using that language of things shifting on a level like it's never been experienced in history before, that God will be victorious. And that will lead to him wiping away the tears from all faces and the reproach of his people he will take away, which is a theme that Isaiah will go on later, even by the end. Isaiah 60 to 65, he's going to start unpacking that a little bit more. But this kind of gives you a small little snapshot of what's going on. But even in the end of that, Isaiah 27, you're going to see the Lord's going to talk about punishing Leviathan, which is a creature that's referenced in Job, the dragon of the sea, and how God's going to slay that, which is a sense of God dealing with the chaos and disorder, because that's often how Leviathan is first perceived. But then right after that, it will talk about a harvest, that God will harvest people from the earth, and he'll bring people in to worship at the holy mountain, and he'll cast people out. And so you get a little snapshot there in Isaiah. But another big passage that a lot of people are familiar with is Ezekiel 38 and 39. And it gets familiar because people end up picking up on it in the book of Revelation, because it gets re-referenced there. And it's really prophecies against this certain leader in a nation called Gog and Magog. And so in that, it's going to start walking through, and it's going to, again, start using terminology of the latter years, of the days of which God has spoken. And it's going to start dealing with these themes of armies moving and doing activity. And again, Ezekiel's seeing this play out, and God's even going to have him prophesy to these leaders in 39. But you're going to see this army from the north that's going to come and attack or Israel who dwells securely. It's going to say in 38:16, you will come up against my people like a cloud covering the lands, and I will bring you against my land, that the nations may know me, when through you, O Gog, I vindicate my holiness before their eyes. where you're going to see God prophesying, but he's going to talk about his direction and guidance even within this. And then it will be followed by a great earthquake, another cosmic type of event. And then it will use terminology of the curse that Israel has in their covenant of if you disobey the covenant, there's going to be, curses by the sword, by pestilence, and it will start using those same type of terms, drawing them out, and it will bring in some of the elements that you also see in stories of the 10 plagues of Egypt or Sodom and Gomorrah. So you'll see torrential rain and hailstorms. You'll see fire and sulfur. So, and
So I've
yeah,
noticed, I mean, just hearing you right now, and pestilence and famine, and the parallel to the period of the Exodus. I mean, that's well, so their actual historical journey provides some of the raw material for their symbol system. I mean, that's really powerful.
yeah, the narrative ends up speaking into how much the prophetic ends up
Wow. Yeah.
kind of unfolding. And even with what's happening in Exodus, one of the things that happens in Exodus quite often is in Exodus 7, God's going to tell Israel, these plagues, these things that are about to happen is so that you, Israel, will know that I am Yahweh, that I am the Lord. And then also he'll say, so that Egypt and the nations know that I am the Lord. So again, all of these go back to that apocalypsis,
Yeah.
the unveiling of God.
Yeah.
And then in Revelation, we're going to see it as the unveiling of Jesus Christ
Yeah.
and how Jesus Christ is the Lamb seated on the same throne as God that you get in Revelation 4. But what's going to happen is as it moves into the next chapter, you're going to see Ezekiel have to do some forthtelling to Gog, and he's really going to be giving this message of, hey, God's going to do this. He's going to lead you, and these things are going to happen, but you will be dealt with. And you're going to see language again that's going to talk about his holy name being known among the midst of Israel and among all the nations. And so it's going to, again, like you were talking about with national eschatology, it's going to be always with the purpose of so that all will see, that it will be spread out. And then it will go back into language of restoration and return from exile. So, but what will happen is within those three little chapters or two chapters, you're really going to see people go a lot of different ways with their interpretation of it. Because some people have misinterpreted terms and they've looked at this as some type of future description of a future attack on Israel from Russia. And they'll use a term in the Hebrew, Rosh, and they'll try to apply that to a modern nation, even though that's not what that term means. And they do a little bit of tricky exegesis, not even tricky, I would say, ill-informed, malnourished exegesis. And then there's others that will look at it as a symbolic description of some future event, either a final conflict with Israel or a final catastrophic struggle. So they'll take it and realize it's a type, it's an analogy of something that will happen, but they don't go that specific on where it's coming from. And then others will look at it as a parable that's illustrating not a specific historical event, but some sort of great truth that whenever in history, and we've talked about this in the previous sessions, whenever in history evil forces array themselves to try to resist or destroy God's people, he comes to their aid. He comes and reminds people that he is king and that he is the deliverer. And so really Gog and Magog that come up and they get used again in Revelation, they become a symbolic representation of the godless nations in the world and God again dealing with them and dealing with the people of Israel. But here's the rub. Here's where it becomes more distinct. We've mentioned it comes up again in the book of Revelation. But when John places it there, he places it right before the reference to Jesus coming back on a white horse with all the hosts behind him to slay the beast. So when John uses it, he uses it to see a final picture of what God's going to do to kind of do the final act of this. But it doesn't mean that God has not done this in previous times for Israel or even for his people that are worshiping and following him.
So the big picture is that eschatology is about this, we might say is the grand story. God is going to get his will done. And secondarily are the specific things.
Yeah.
Now those may be a part of the authentic part of the prophetic imagination, but to focus on those and miss the bigger picture That you're saying that's probably a mistake then.
Yeah, because you have to pay attention
Yeah.
to how it's being used and why. So
I think that's exactly right.
yeah, and I think we have to keep dialoguing through it in order
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
see it. So that moves us into kind of the big kind of crux of all of this, which is the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel becomes the very key book that the first half is all these narratives that actually are playing into the visions that Daniel will have, but they're narratives of Daniel and the three being in exile in Babylon. And while they're there, they're interpreting dreams and visions for kings, and they're engaging with how do you live as a distinctive people in a world that doesn't recognize your faith and your belief and really can
Mhm.
persecute and destroy you. And from that, you go into the second half of Daniel and you hit the visions. And what you're going to have is you're going to move from Daniel interpreting kings' dreams and visions to now Daniel having his own dream and vision. And so it's going to again start using that imagery of you're going to have four beasts coming up out of the sea, and those beasts are going to have horns and 10 horns, and one horn is going to rise up and it's going to have eyes and mouth like a man, which is again trying to represent leaders and leaders of strength in these empires that are going to be rising. And it will tell you that what's going to happen is in verse 21, it's going to say, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. And it's saying that while talking about all these kingdoms and these beasts and these horns
Mhm.
rising up. And then it's going to shift gears because you're going to see that these kings and these beasts somehow are doing something to this one that's like a son of man. But then suddenly it's going to shift in verse 9, and the Son of Man is going to be approaching the Ancient of Days, which is a term for the Lord. And you're going to see this throne room scene where he's going to come, he's going to be seated at the right hand, and the beast is judged and destroyed. And all dominion and glory and the kingdom is now given to the Son of Man. And all peoples, it goes back to all nations, all languages will serve him. And his dominion is everlasting. And then the dream will be interpreted, the vision will be interpreted on what those four kings are and what those beasts are, and it will talk in a little bit more detail. So it kind of will like go over something and then come back and go over
Yeah.
it again. And again, it's all talking about God vindicating people who are suffering for worshiping him, and him bringing his kingdom rule in. And we'll keep coming back around to the kingdoms and the empires are going to continue to resist. They're going to continue to rebel, but God's kingdom is always coming, and it always is the strength, and it is the greatest peace happening. So that will then move into Daniel
Mhm.
chapter 8, which will again almost like loop through the issues again, but it'll be even more specific. It'll talk about a ram with two horns charging, and that's going to be Medo-Persians. And then it's going to say there's a floating goat with a horn. I mean, these are fun pictures to imagine, and that's supposed to be Greece, and they're going to be coming towards each other, and horns are going to be broken, and more horns are going to
Mhm.
rise. And all of this has to do with knowing ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman history. And then it's going to move on to one horn is going to rise up. And as that horn is rising up, again, you're almost seeing this one beast rising up in greatest resistance, and you're going to see it going on again. And so it's going to be almost circling through the same type of vision again. And there's going to be holy dialogue on how long is this going to be, and that's where it's going to be specified to Daniel that these things are going to be made known. And it ends up saying in verse 19, I behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. And so again, now it's looking farther out and it's trying to unpack some stuff for Daniel, but it still doesn't give us clarity. And so that's where you move into another complex chapter, chapter 9 of Daniel, where you're going to see Daniel hear all this, and he's going to be almost distraught over it. And he's going to end up doing this prayer. And then he's going to start going into a vision that one of the angelic mediators is going to come and give him a vision again, where it's going to talk about the numbers. And that's where you're going to see these, okay, 77s are decreed, and it's really overall going to be trying to say God has a plan that is playing out, and it will come to pass. But it's going to be very specific in the message it's bringing. Sometimes people get caught up, and David and I, you and I were talking about this before. People get sometimes so caught up on the numbers that they
Yeah.
miss the message.
Yeah.
And what will happen is, although it's going to talk about 77s, which some people will be like, well, that's easy. That's 7 years times 70, that's 490. And again, Daniel had been dealing with the prophecy of Jeremiah about them returning from exile after 70 years. But what will happen is it's going to say that after all this, then transgression and rebellion will be finished. God will put an end to sin. He'll atone for wickedness. He'll bring this forgiveness and this everlasting righteousness, and an anointed, and he will anoint the most holy. And it kind of implies it's an holy person. And then that's where people go, okay, this is obviously pointing towards some type of messianic or some type of um, this transformational moment in history. And it's pointing towards that. And then people kind of go back and forth on, well, does that happen with the advent or the coming of Jesus? Or did that come in a lot of different periods? And we don't want to take the time right now to get into all the details and the different arguments, but people have to always decide, is that a Christological, a Christ-centered reading, or a non-Christological? But then it will start going into more dates and times that we don't want to bog everyone down with, but it's going to have more descriptions of the restoration and the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and then this anointed one coming, but him being cut off. And then there's going to be, again, a ruler that's going to rise up. The same themes we've seen already in Daniel. And then he will come and destroy the sanctuary and the city. And then you'll start seeing these terms again that start bringing it into the cosmic, more immediate for people. It says the end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. And that even gets picked up by Jesus in Matthew 24, where he's going to talk about similar images, visions to expect. And he's going to say, but again, these are only birthing pains. And then it will get into a piece that's a final 7, and that's where you're going to see it's going to be pointing towards a final end, but it's not telling us exactly all the details, but it's trying to give you some pieces to realize in the message. And again, the enemy of God who rises up is going to be beat by God. That's one of the primary messages it's trying to bring out of all the pieces that it's going to give details on, that people sometimes try to assign to different pieces. And then Daniel's not even done. Then he still goes in to chapters 10 and chapters 11, where he'll again go through elements of ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman history. And you're going to see more things about kings rising up and allying, and a king from the north coming in and having battle against the people of the Holy Covenant. And so again, you're going to see all the visions looping through this same element. And again, they always end up with the same message, that God and his kingdom and his empire are what will reign. That's what's always going to be brought to completion.
But also, I think you're totally right. But also a part of it, I think, is not just God and his empire, but there's also this other empire, the empire of human desire and human striving, and that's just us big picture. We're broken and can't fix ourselves, but when you put a bunch of us together and they decide to form a nation state, now there's a whole bunch of potential for bad to happen. Mm-hmm. So it is once again this huge, this overarching meta picture of history, God's kingdom, as opposed to human empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all of his visions, cycling back through that. And then they come to the end, and they always, just like Ezekiel and just like Isaiah, it will come back to this aspect of the dead are awakened to life, or they're awakened to contempt.
Yeah.
And so although it's going to talk about times of trouble and all these things, it will always come back to that same picture of restoration and of recreation and of renewal that happens. And that's where I think, though, people still ask the same question that Daniel asks at the end, where how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? And I think that's always the main question people are dealing with eschatology. And we talked about this in the first session. Is this the time? How long is this going to happen? And although Daniel gets an answer, that's where it's still very cryptic. It's time, times, and half a time. and really, I think technically in the Hebrew, it's time, and time and a half is how it's interpreted, which is very much a 3.5 years. But that's a symbolic number itself, because 7 is often the number of perfection. So 3.5 is saying you're halfway through perfection to a fullness that's going to happen. And a lot of people, they look at all this and they go, okay, maybe this happened with a leader named Antiochus that came from Syria in 160 and did some of the things that we see here that the horn and the beasts are doing. Some of people look at as some Roman emperors in AD 70 coming and doing this to Jerusalem, and some people look at it as a future event that will occur at the end. And I like what one guy says. He says maybe all of these are to offer hope of the repeated failings and evil that will come, and the hope for all generations of God's people. That maybe
Yeah.
it's every time these type of things start happening, we're reminded of the hope and the fact that God is sovereign and his
Yeah.
kingdom will rule. So, and then one great final picture that I'm not going to take time to go into in detail is you'll see another prophecy that's at the end of the exile, Zechariah chapters 12 to 14, where it's going to talk about the final day, and it's going to give all this imagery of the Lord coming down on the Mount of Olives, and this picture that we've been seeing in all these other apocalyptic visions are going to be a picture of him coming down and everybody finally recognizing that he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And my favorite line in all of it, and if you get a chance, read Zechariah 12 to 14. It's one of many visions
Yeah.
in Zechariah, but it's going to say, and on that day, he will be Lord. There will be one Lord, and his name will be the only name. And it's going to take all that, but it's going to have the same thing of it's going to have people rising up. It's going to have cosmic pieces happening. It's going to have final cleansing happening over idolatry and sin. Again, the reason why we're showing you all these is that all of these end up looping the same pictures, the same language all the way through. And so we do this again to kind of walk through and just realize that just the Old Testament alone has so much that's so layered, and they're using analogy. They're using so many things to say it's like this, and it's like this, and it's like this. And these writers, these holy people of God, they're looking at these things and trying to describe in words something that they can't even fully understand. And so as they're giving all this analogy and this layering, we're then as readers going, okay, well, what does this mean? And what does this mean? And so that's going to start taking us into the New Testament, because that layering is going to continue. And so do you want to kind of just transition us, David, into kind of what we're going to be talking about a little bit here and into the next session, with how the New Testament takes some of this and starts kind of walking us further, in a sense, but with similar cycles?
Yeah, certainly. So we'll begin dealing with the New Testament, first of all, with some of Paul's catalog of images. And you even brought this up about Antiochus in 160 BC, Caligula, and then maybe even Nero. And so these are abominations of desolation, but it happens over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it is about the specific, but it's also about the big picture. I think forest for the trees.
Yeah.
And if we focus all of our attention on only the trees, then we miss the bigger picture of the forest, of God's big plan. But they're both at work. So New Testament, we'll see examples of individual eschatology, some of Paul's letters, which is once again the basis of hope.
Mm-hmm.
is that because Christ was raised from the dead, we have hope that we have a future in God's plan. But also what's national eschatology. Spent a little bit of time on, let's say, Mark 13, the so-called little apocalypse, where the disciples ask Jesus as they're walking out of Jerusalem, they pass the temple and they say, man, these are awesome buildings. And he says, well, there's going to come a day when there's not going to be one stone on top of another. So we'll talk a little bit about that passage. And then we'll end by spending a good deal of time unpacking the book of Revelation.
Yeah, and all this will be very helpful, because it's going to start putting us in a spot to go, okay, our Lord and Savior Jesus ended up speaking about this. And then, one of the key apostles in the New Testament, Paul, he's going to end up also getting a chance to go, okay, these are things that Jesus was saying, and the 12 were repeating some of the message, and he's going to try to remind the churches there. And then John's still going to get that in this apocalyptic vision at the very end, which is called an apocalypsis, right? It's going to be the unveiling. And again, in exile, he's going to be unpacking this. And so there's still a lot more that we're going to cover, and we'll get into that here in our final session. So we'll see you again very soon, and continue to dive into the scriptures and write notes, write questions, and let us know some other things that we can be helping you with.